Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alamin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya wal mursalin Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Alhamdulillah, my dear respected brothers and sisters. Inshallah ta'ala, we will continue in our lesson in the book Sullam al-Munawwar, written by Al-Imam al-Akhdari in the field of Mantiq, that is logic. And we pray that Allah bless all of us with tawfiq and in hidayah. And may Allah make this lesson a reason may our sins are forgiven, our prayers are answered, inshallah. May Allah protect us from all forms of difficulties, trials and tribulations in dunya and akhirah. Ameen. Ya Rabbal Alameen. So let us go back into where we were mentioning and where we were in our last lesson. So this is basically where we were in the matan of Sullam. So we began by speaking about the ashkal. The author mentioned faslun fil ashkal, and we mentioned ashkal are the types of syllogism. Are the types of syllogism, and it depends on where the subject of the conclusion is and where the predicate of the conclusion is. So for example, we spoke about the first shakl, which is the first figure, where the subject of the conclusion is in the minor premise, whereas the predicate of the conclusion is at the major premise. So the subject of the first premise, the subject of the first premise is the conclusion of is the subject of the conclusion, whereas the predicate of the conclusion lies in the second premise as the predicate. So this is basically we mentioned about the first figure or the first shakl. In English and in logic they call it ashkal, the figures, the types of figures. So it depends on where the subject of the conclusion is and where the predicate of the conclusion is. So altogether we mentioned there are four. This is where the author mentioned walil muqaddimati ashkalun faqat arba'atun bihasabil haddil wasat. So he mentioned that when it comes to the premises, there are only four figures. There are only four types of ashkal bihasabil haddil awsat. And this is important. It goes back to the middle term. In logic they call it the middle term. We call it haddul wasat. Haddul wasat is the occurring term that occurs in between the first premise and the second premise. And I have given the example, inshallah, later on you will see it again. So this basically where we were, and we mentioned there are the four figures. There are the four figures. So we have figure number 1, number 2, number 3 and number 4. So I will just show you again, inshallah. So we'll do it slowly. There is no need for us to rush. There is no need for us to rush. So this is basically what we mentioned when it comes to the four figures. Four figures, al ashkal wal arba'a. So this is the example in Arabic. So the one highlighted is called the middle term. It is the occurring term, and it doesn't appears in the subject, in the conclusion. It doesn't appear in the conclusion. So earlier I mentioned the shaklul awwal, in the first figure, the subject of the first premise, or we say the minor premise, is the subject of the conclusion, whereas the predicate of the conclusion lies in the second premise. So this is called shaklul awwal. So you find all these differences in terms of the middle term where they are. So if both of them are the predicates of the two premises, then it's considered to be the second type, whereas if both the subjects are in both premises, this is the third figure, and then the last one is the opposite of the first, as what we see here. So this is basically what we covered in our last lesson. So now we are going to go back to the first figure. So we are going this one by one to understand what are the conditions that the conclusion is true. What are the conclusions of the first figure in order for us to ascertain that the conclusion is that the conclusion yani is correct. So there are a few yani possibilities. So these are the subject yani for today. This is what yani we are going yani to speak about. Firstly, we go back yani to the matan. We see yani what the author mentioned. Then inshallah yani I will bring the examples. So we have reached this part where after any the author any speaks any about what is the first shackle, second shackle, third shackle, fourth shackle, and then yani he mentioned فَحَيْثُ أَنْ هَذَا النِّظَامِ يُعْدَلُ فَفَاسِدُ النِّظَامِ. So he is going any to speak any about any the conditions, because if certain any conditions any are mentioned are met, then they will give the proper yani conclusion, which is the truth. But if certain any conditions any are not met, then it will not provide any proper conclusion. So then he is going to speak any about the conditions any of this syllogism, these types any of syllogism, or we call it any as the figures. So he said ammal awwalu, as the first figure, as the first any figure. So he mentioned any these are the conditions. We have to pay attention here. So he said fashartuhu al ijabu fi surahu. So by now any we should be familiar with some any of these terms. He said fashartuhu, the first any condition of the first figure, that is a shaklul awwal, and in order for us any to ascertain that the conclusion yani is correct and the argument yani is correct, he said that the first premise yani is the minor premise. Surahu here yani refers any to minor premise, yani the first any premise, it must be al ijab, yani al ijab here yani meanings al mujab, it is positive. The first any premise must be a positive proposition. It must be a positive any sentence any basically. So this is any the first condition. The first any premise must be positive, a positive any sentence. And then number two, the second any condition that he said wa antura kulliyatun kubrahu, that the kubra yani the major premise yani the second any premise, second major premise here any meaning the predicate any of the conclusion is the predicate any of that premise. We call it any the major premise. So this premise any must be universal. It cannot be particular. It must be universal. So this is the condition for us any to say, as far as the first figure any is concerned, that the conclusion yani is correct. So now when we go back to a table, which I will explain this better inshallah. So sometimes when learning any of these things, and when you look at poetry, I know it's difficult. Last time when I studied this, subhanallah just looking at these words of Al-Imam Al-Akhdari, and is tough for beginners, and I believe this is the thing. Unless when you go back to the examples, so learning any Mantiq has to be given some examples or some tables of some sort. Then inshallah it become easier. So this is what we are going to do inshallah. This is the table. Okay, let me explain. I know all this is in Arabic. Okay, let me explain this. I do not have time to translate this, but I'll just do it here. So here we have Asura, and if you see on the screen, you have here is Asura. Here we are speaking about the minor premise. Basically the first premise. Basically the first premise. So these are the possibilities of the first premise. Possibility number one, and we go to one by one, is mujaba kulliya. It is a positive universal proposition. Positive universal proposition. The second possibility is a negative universal proposition. So the difference between the first and the second is basically in terms of positivity. This is a positive sentence. This is a negative sentence. And then comes the universals and particulars. Here we have mujaba juz'iyya. We have the positive particular juz'iyya, positive particular proposition, and then we have saliba juz'iyya, the negative particular proposition. So these are how many possibilities we have when it comes to the minor premise? 4 possibilities. Positive universal, negative universal, positive particular, negative particular. So this is the 4 possibilities. And then now when we look at the major premise also has 4 possibilities. 4 possibilities in terms of positivity of the sentence, and in terms of universality of the sentence. So the first possibility is mujaba kulliyah. This is a positive universal. Then we have saliba kulliyah, negative universal. Then we have mujaba juz'iyah, positive particular. Then we have saliba juz'iyah, negative particular. So just like this possibilities, here also we have this possibility. So this is the minor premise, meaning the first premise. This is the second premise. So now if we apply the 2 conditions, what are the 2 conditions? The minor premise must be positive. The minor premise must be positive. The second premise must be universal. This is the two condition. This is where the author mentioned fashartuhul ijabu fi surahu wa antura kulliyatun kubrahu. So the surah, the minor premise must be positive. The second premise must be universal. So now when we apply that 2 condition, first premise must be positive, second premise must be universal. So now we add this and this. First premise mujaba kulliyah. So the first thing correct, it is a positive proposition. Tamam, mujaba kulliyah. And then the second premise is mujaba kulliyah. It is a universal. It is a universal proposition. So the first condition is that it must be positive. Second condition, it must be universal. So now here it is muntij. Muntij meaning the conclusion is correct. That this kind of syllogism will provide a correct conclusion. This is the meaning of muntij. Muntij meaning this syllogism, this argument is correct, and in a sense that it gives the proper conclusion. So this is the first one. The second one, if you put here saliba kulliyah, if the minor premise is saliba, negative. Now you do not have the condition, because the condition must be positive. But since you have this negative, so straight away we say this is aqim. Aqim meaning it cannot bring about the conclusion. It cannot bring about the proper and the correct conclusion. So we say this is aqim. So aqim is the opposite of muntij. Aqim is the opposite of muntij. So once the first condition is not present, it doesn't matter. Even if you have the major premise as mujaba kulliyah, you have universality in the major premise, it's still aqim. Because why? Because the first premise is a negative one. Saliba here meaning negative. Now we go into the third possibility. The third possibility, mujaba juz'iyah. So now we see this mujaba, this is positivity, and it is a particular preposition, and there is it is not universal, it is particular, like the word some. So now you have the first condition correct, it's mujaba, it's positive. Now we look at the major premise is mujaba kulliyah, so it is muntij. Because why? This is a universal proposition. Later on I'll give examples to this. Later on I'll give example. I'll just explain this first. So this is one, muntij. Then the fourth possibility, saliba juz'iyah. Since this is saliba, this is a negative proposition, then straight away it is aqim. It doesn't gives the proper conclusion. So now we go to the second possibility of both the minor and major premise. So the first is mujaba kulliyah, then this is saliba kulliyah, this is muntij. So it doesn't matter, this is negative, but it is kulliyah, it is universal. So we say it is muntij. Why? Because it fulfills the 2 conditions. And all this go back to the 2 conditions. The minor premise must be positive, the major premise must be universal. So this is muntij. When comes into the second, saliba kulliyah, so we see all is aqim. Because why? Because if the muqaddimah surah saliba is negative, all will be aqim. It will not give a correct conclusion. a correct any form and of conclusion. So we see this consistency here. Tamam. Likewise, we see the saliba juz'iyya, all is aqim. So easy any for us any to see in terms any of these two. But when comes into the third, this is mujaba juz'iyya, this is and then the kubra is saliba kulliyya. This is also muntij. This is also muntij because kulliyya, the second any premise. And then when comes any to the last one, saliba juz'iyya, this is saliba kulliyya, this is aqim any. Why? Because it's what we mentioned, this is the saliba. So I hope it is clear, inshallah. So all the rest any you can see. So these are the possibilities. So you have the four possibility for the surah and the four possibility any of the kubra. So 4 you times 4, how many possibilities any you have? You have 16. So all this any you have how many? 4 plus 4 plus 4 plus 4. Here we have 16. The 16 any possibilities. Out of these 16, how many are muntij? This is the question and we ask. How many are muntij? So we find 1, 2, 3, 4. So only these 4 situations where the conclusions any are correct. So what are the situations? Or what are the figures? We say this is mujaba kulliyya and mujaba kulliyya. This is the first one. Then we have mujaba kulliyya, saliba kulliyya. This is the second one. Then here we have mujaba juz'iyya, and then we have mujaba saliba kulliyya. Mujaba juz'iyya and mujaba kulliyya, mujaba juz'iyya and saliba kulliyya. So these are the 4 muntij. So we have any to pay attention any to the muntij. As for the aqim, any we say all this any are false. All this any cannot give you the correct any conclusion. So only any these four figures or these 4 types any of syllogism, and when comes any to the first figure, that can give you the proper conclusion. So now any we look any at the example. Okay, now when we go to the examples, all my examples are in Arabic as usual, and I hope that inshallah we can study the language so that we can gain benefit from this book. I'll just do some adjustment first. Okay, let us look at this example. So now when we look at this example, this is basically the first any shackle, the first figure, the first any figure. So the first type here, we have the first any premise, surahu mujaba kulliyya, kubrahu mujaba kulliyya. But before that, just let me explain the four types. Why these are the 4 types that is muntij. So what I'm showing is basically the 4 muntij. Remember the 4 muntij? That's not any I show. So now we put it on paper and we bring the examples. So this is the 4 types of the first figure, shakl awwal. So this is the first darbul awwal, darbul thani, darbul thalith, darbul rabi'. So these are the 4 types in which we took out from the earlier schedule. So number 1, we have mujaba kulliyya and mujaba kulliyya. The minor premise is a positive universal. The major premise is also a positive universal. So the example is kullu insan hayawan. This is the example. Kullu insan hayawan. So this is a positive universal. Why positive and universal? Because the word kullu meaning all. So this is universal. Kullu insan hayawan. This is a positive statement. This is a positive statement. So the two conditions are met. Number one, that the the minor premise here is positive. So this is the minor premise. Kullu insan hayawan. And then when comes to the major premise, second premise, wa kullu hayawan jism. So the first premise, kullu insan hayawan. Second premise, kullu hayawan jism. So here you have the universal here. Wa kullu hayawan jism. So this is the second condition and it is met. This is the second condition is met. So now we have the conclusion. So the conclusion is kullu insan jismun. Now this is a correct conclusion. So we say this is Mantiq. Tamam? So this is the first example. The second example, mujaba kulliya is the first premise. The second premise, saliba kulliya. So the example of the first premise, kullu insan hayawan, this is a positive statement. Whereas the second premise, la shay'a minal insan bihajarin. La shay'a is universal here, but it is negative, no issue, because it is the second premise. Second premise, we do not take into consideration whether it is positive statement or negative statement. What is important is universe, that it is universal. So la shay'a is a universal statement, meaning nothing at all, nothing at all. Minal hayawan bihajar, amongst any living beings are stones. Any stones, there's nothing from stones and the class of stones that can be classified as living beings, because stones are non-living things. So what is the conclusion? La shay'a minal insani bihajar. So there is nothing amongst any human beings that is classified as stones. So this is the second example. The third example, the first premise, mujaba juz'iyya, second premise, mujaba kulliyya. Again, it is a positive sentence, just like we say ba'dul insan hayawan. Now this is an example of a particular. The opposite of universal is particular. So universal, we say kullu, all. Particular, we say some. Tamam? All humans are beings. Then we say some beings are humans. So some beings are humans. Just like what we mentioned here, ba'dul hayawan insan. Some beings, some living beings are humans. This is the correct statement. Some living beings are humans. So when we use the word some, this is an example of a particular proposition. So this is the first premise. The first premise, it is positive sentence. Then the second premise, it is, as what we mentioned, it must be universal. So then we say kullu insan natiq. All humans are intellectual. All humans are intellectual. Then what is the conclusion? The conclusion is ba'dul insan natiq. Some humans are intellectual, which is a correct conclusion. Then we have now this is the third example. Then the fourth example is, the first premise is mujaba juz'iyya, second premise saliba kulliyya. Again, the first premise is positive, but it is the particular example, which is particular, not universal. Just like when we say ba'dul hayawan insan, some beings are humans. And then when comes to the second premise, la shay'a minal insani bifarasin. Nothing from human beings are horses, are classified as horses. So this is a negative statement, but it is okay because it is in the second premise, that is a major premise. What we are concerned is a major premise. The second condition is what we mentioned, that it must be universal, and thus universality is present here. Thus we have the correct conclusion, and in that conclusion is laisa ba'dul hayawan bifaras. Some beings are non-horses, and which is a true statement. So these are the examples of application of the conditions, the two conditions of the figure number 1, the shaklul awwal. So these are the 4 Mantiq from amongst how many? From amongst 16. So let us look again at the 16. This is the 16 just now we mentioned. These are the 16. So just now earlier what I meant is this 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. The examples that we gave are the 4 examples of the Mantiq. The rest you see here are all aqim. All these possibilities. 4 we times 4, all we get 16. All these are the aqim. Whereas the muntij we only have 4. So we concentrate on the muntij. The ones that of the correct and the conclusion. And because this is the way of Mantiq, we are not really concerned about the aqim. But it is just important for us to understand why it is aqim and not any muntij. When we apply how many conditions? When we apply the 2 conditions. So now we will go back to the matan. This is what is meant when the author mentioned fashartuhul ijabu fi surahu. Al-ijab again it means positivity. The first premise or the minor premise must be a positive a proposition. And then as for the kubra, the major premise, that is second premise, it must be kulliyah, it must be universal. So all these things basically we are just speaking of one of this line. Now the next week inshallah we speak about wasani, the other figures of syllogism. Wallahu a'lam bis-shawab. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Allahumma salli wa sallim ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala ali sayyidina Muhammad. Rabbana atina fid dunya hasanah wa fil akhirati hasanah wa qina adhaban nar. Sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi sallam. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.